In 1933, a small group of Germany's wealthiest industrialists gathered in secret. What happened in that room would change the course of history forever. They weren't politicians, they weren't soldiers, they were businessmen, CEOs, bankers, the people who controlled Germany's factories, its coal mines, its chemical plants. And they were about to write checks that would put Adolf Hitler in power. This is the story most history classes skip, the one that's uncomfortable to tell, because it reveals a dark truth. The Nazi Party didn't rise to power on hate alone. It rose on money, corporate money, millions of marks from some of the most respected companies in Germany. Companies you've probably heard of, companies that still exist today. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how big business bankrolled fascism and why they thought it was a good investment. Let's rewind to 1929. Germany was broken. The Treaty of Versailles had crushed its economy with impossible war reparations. Then the Great Depression hit like a sledgehammer. By 1932, 6 million Germans were unemployed. That's 1 in 3 workers. The currency was worthless. People were starving in the streets. The Weimar Republic, Germany's democratic government, seemed powerless to stop the bleeding. But here's what most people don't realize. While ordinary Germans suffered, the country's industrialists faced a different kind of crisis. Workers were organizing. Strikes were constant. The Communist Party was growing stronger every day, winning millions of votes. And for Germany's business elite, communism meant one thing: the seizure of private property, the end of their empires. The industrialists needed a solution. They needed someone strong enough to crush the left, but controllable enough to protect their interests. Enter Adolf Hitler. The Nazi Party had been around since 1920, but it was small, fringe, almost laughable. Hitler's beer hall putsch in 1923 had failed miserably. He'd gone to prison. By all accounts, he should have faded into obscurity. But the Nazis had something the industrialists found useful: a massive paramilitary force called the SA, the Brown Shirts. Hundreds of thousands of street fighters who could intimidate communists, break up strikes, and create the chaos that would make Germans desperate for order. All Hitler needed was money, lots of it. And Germany's corporations were about to provide exactly that. The relationship between big business and the Nazis didn't start in 1933. It started years earlier, quietly, with a handful of industrialists who saw potential in Hitler's anti-communist message. One of the first was Emil Kirdorf, a coal baron who controlled the Ruhr Valley's mining operations. In 1927, Kirdorf met Hitler and was impressed by his fierce opposition to unions and Marxism. Kirdorf opened his wallet and, more importantly, opened doors to other wealthy industrialists. Then there was Fritz Thyssen, heir to a steel empire. Thyssen became one of Hitler's earliest and most generous supporters, funneling money to the Nazi Party throughout the late 1920s. He even wrote a book about it later, titled I Paid Hitler. These early donors gave the Nazi Party something it desperately needed: credibility. When men like Thyssen backed Hitler, other business leaders started paying attention. But the real flood of corporate money didn't come until the early 1930s, when Germany's political situation became truly desperate. The Nazis were gaining seats in the Reichstag, Germany's parliament. In 1930, they went from 12 seats to 107. By July 1932, they were the largest party with 230 seats. Hitler was no longer a fringe lunatic. He was a serious contender for power. And Germany's corporate elite decided it was time to place their bets. February 20th, 1933. This is the date that sealed Germany's fate. Hermann Göring, one of Hitler's top lieutenants, invited roughly 24 of Germany's most powerful industrialists to a secret meeting at the Reichstag President's Palace in Berlin. Who was in that room? Gustav Krupp, head of the Krupp armaments empire. Georg von Schnitzler, from IG Farben, the chemical conglomerate. Albert Vogler, from United Steelworks. Representatives from Siemens, Telefunken, and other industrial giants. These weren't Nazi ideologues. These were pragmatic businessmen who saw Hitler as a tool. Hitler himself attended and gave a speech. He promised to eliminate Marxism, destroy the trade unions, rebuild Germany's military, and restore order through authoritarian rule. Most importantly, he promised to protect private enterprise and property rights. It was music to their ears. After Hitler left, Göring made the ask. He told the industrialists that the upcoming election would be the last one for 10 years, maybe 100 years. The implication was clear. Help us win this, and you'll never have to worry about communists or democracy again. Then Hjalmar Schacht, a respected banker and future economics minister, passed around a collection plate. The industrialists pledged 3 million Reichsmarks on the spot. That's roughly equivalent to $25 million today. This wasn't charity. This was an investment, and they expected returns. Hehehe. Let's break down exactly which corporations funded the Nazi rise and what they got in return. IG Farben was perhaps the most significant contributor. This chemical giant produced everything from dyes to pharmaceuticals to synthetic rubber. They gave generously to the Nazis and, in return, received massive government contracts. During the war, IG Farben would operate a factory at Auschwitz using concentration camp labor. Several executives were later convicted at Nuremberg. Krupp, the steel and arms manufacturer, had been arming Germany for generations. They saw in Hitler someone who would rebuild the military and tear up the Treaty of Versailles restrictions on armament. They were right. Krupp became one of the primary weapons suppliers for the Wehrmacht. Siemens, the electrical engineering giant, provided funding and technical support. They would go on to use forced labor extensively during the war. BMW, Daimler-Benz, now Mercedes-Benz, and other automotive companies supported the Nazis and later produced vehicles and aircraft engines for the military using slave labor. Deutsche Bank and Dresdner Bank provided the financial infrastructure, laundering money, financing arms production, and managing the assets seized from Jewish victims. What did these corporations want? First, the destruction of labor unions. The Nazis delivered, smashing unions within months of taking power and replacing them with a state-controlled labor front. Second, rearmament contracts. Hitler's military buildup created unlimited demand for steel, chemicals, vehicles, and weapons. Third, the elimination of competition. Many Jewish-owned businesses were Aryanized, meaning they were seized and sold at bargain prices to connected industrialists. Fourth, access to slave labor. As the war progressed, millions of concentration camp prisoners and forced laborers were rented out to private companies at minimal cost. It was a devil's bargain, and German corporations profited enormously from it. Here's something crucial to understand. These industrialists didn't just give money and walk away. They embedded themselves in the Nazi state. Many corporate leaders joined the Nazi Party, not out of ideology necessarily, but for access and influence. Being a party member opened doors, secured contracts, and protected their interests. The relationship was symbiotic. The Nazis needed industrial capacity to rearm Germany and pursue their expansionist goals. The industrialists needed the Nazi state to suppress labor, eliminate competitors, and provide captive markets through conquest. Gustav Krupp, who had initially been skeptical of Hitler, became a true believer after the Nazis took power. He led an association of industrialists that channeled millions more to the party over the years. IG Farben executives sat on government committees, advising on economic policy and chemical warfare development. The line between corporation and state blurred completely. And when the war started, these companies ramped up production using an expanding pool of forced labor. Prisoners from concentration camps, POWs, and civilians from occupied territories were worked to death in factories producing everything from chemicals to fighter planes. The profits were staggering. Shareholders grew rich while millions died. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. After the war, very few of these corporations faced real consequences. When World War II ended, the Allies held the Nuremberg trials to prosecute Nazi war criminals. Most people know about the trials of Hitler's top officials, Göring, Hess, Speer. But there were also the subsequent trials, including the industrialist cases. The I.G. Farben trial convicted 13 executives for crimes including mass murder and slavery. But the sentences were light. Most served only a few years. And I.G. Farben itself? It was broken up into separate companies, including BASF, Bayer, and Hoechst, which all continued operating and eventually flourished. Krupp executives were convicted at Nuremberg, but most were released early and their property was restored. The Krupp company survived, thrived, and eventually merged with Thyssen to become ThyssenKrupp, which exists today. Siemens, BMW, Volkswagen, Deutsche Bank, they all survived. Some paid modest reparations decades later. Most issued carefully worded apologies, but none were destroyed. Why? The Cold War changed everything. Western powers needed a strong West Germany as a bulwark against Soviet communism. Dismantling its industrial base seemed counterproductive, so the very companies that had funded fascism and used slave labor were rehabilitated, their expertise needed for reconstruction. It's one of history's uncomfortable ironies. The corporations that helped bring Hitler to power not only survived, but became pillars of the post-war economic order. So what should we take away from this history? First, fascism doesn't rise in a vacuum. It needs money, infrastructure, and institutional support. In Germany's case, that support came from the business elite, who saw Hitler as a solution to their labor problems and a guarantor of their profits. Second, corporate interests and human rights can come into catastrophic conflict. When profit is the only motive, when short-term gains outweigh moral considerations, the results can be horrific. Third, accountability matters. The fact that so few corporations faced meaningful consequences sent a message. Collaboration with evil regimes, if profitable enough, is forgivable. We see echoes of this pattern throughout history. Corporations that funded apartheid in South Africa. Companies that operate in authoritarian states today, turning a blind eye to human rights abuses. The pursuit of profit in the absence of ethics leads to predictable places. The story of how corporations funded the Nazi rise isn't just about the past. It's a warning about what happens when economic power and political extremism align, when business leaders choose order over justice, when quarterly earnings matter more than human dignity. The industrialists who funded Hitler thought they were making a smart business decision. They thought they could control him, use him to protect their interests, and maintain their wealth and power. They were wrong. Hitler used them just as much as they used him. And when the whole system collapsed, millions were dead, Europe was in ruins, and those same industrialists tried to claim they had no idea what would happen. But they knew. They always knew. The next time you hear someone say that fascism could never happen again, or that corporations are politically neutral, remember February 20th, 1933. Remember that room full of businessmen who decided that destroying democracy was an acceptable cost of doing business. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it does rhyme, and the rhythm sounds a lot like the clink of coins changing hands.